By the time the window cracked, the truth was already on its way. The parking lot outside the convenience store sat under a wash of pale white light, the kind that made everything look colder after midnight. And for a second, all Elias Turner could see was the sharp reflection of red and blue flashing across the glass beside him. He had just come off a 12-hour shift, his collared shirt still neat, his wedding band catching a little of that restless light as his hand rested on the steering wheel. His phone was still connected to the truck speakers, the last words from his sister hanging in the silence after she told him to get home safe. And he had been thinking about nothing more dramatic than whether there was enough milk left for his daughter's cereal in the morning. Then Officer Brandon Cole stepped into view with the kind of certainty that never asked questions because it had already decided on its answers. His boots cut across the oil-stained pavement, his flashlight beam slicing through the cab, his jaw tight, his voice louder than it needed to be. He shouted for Elias to show his hands, and Elias did exactly that. Slowly, carefully, every movement measured the way a man learns to move when he knows being calm is not just a choice, but a kind of shield. Around them, the night seemed to hold its breath. A woman at the gas pump stopped with the nozzle in her hand. A teenager near the ice machine lowered his headphones. Somewhere in the distance, tires hissed over wet asphalt, and the police radio on Brandon's shoulder crackled with the static rhythm of a city still awake. "Step out of the vehicle," Brandon barked, but he was not speaking like a man conducting a stop. He was speaking like a man performing a verdict. Elias turned his head just enough to look at him, his eyes steady, his posture still. He did not argue. He did not reach. He did not give Brandon the fear he seemed to be hunting for. And maybe that was what made the officer angrier, because some men mistake calm for defiance when it comes from the wrong face. Brandon moved closer, one hand near his belt, the other motioning hard toward the door, and when Elias quietly said, "Officer, I haven't done anything," the words disappeared into the flashing lights as if innocence itself had become too ordinary to matter. The truck door opened halfway, then stopped, and in the next breath there came a sudden sharp sound as the side window gave way under Brandon's forceful strike. Not a grotesque thing, not a spectacle, just one shocking burst of noise that made every head in the lot turn at once. The woman at the pump gasped. The teenager pulled out his phone. Tiny pieces glittered across the seat like frozen rain. But Elias did not shout. He did not lunge. He only flinched once, then looked straight ahead, breathing through the moment with a control that felt almost impossible. Imagine sitting there, heart pounding, knowing the man outside your door already sees you as the story he wants to tell. Brandon reached in, voice hard, commanding Elias out into the cold Missouri air, while overhead the store's buzzing sign flickered like it couldn't decide whether to witness any more of this. And then, just as the officer squared his shoulders like he had the whole night locked in his grip, the radio on his chest came alive with a dispatcher's voice that was clear, direct, and less than 10 seconds away from changing everything. The dispatcher's voice cut through the noise with the flat certainty of someone reading a fact that could not be argued with. Unit 12, be advised, suspect is already in custody. Repeat, the suspect is already in custody. For one strange second, the whole parking lot seemed to go still, as if even the flashing lights had lost some of their swagger. Elias stood beside his truck with his hands visible, cool night air brushing against the sleeve of his shirt where tiny fragments of glass still clung, and he watched Officer Brandon Cole without saying a word. That silence mattered. It was not fear now. It was not surrender either. It was the kind of silence that forced a man to hear himself. Brandon pressed a hand against the radio on his shoulder, his face tightening, his eyes flicking away from Elias, and then back again, as though he could somehow drag the moment backward and make the voice disappear. "Confirm that," he snapped, louder than necessary, because some men raise their voices when control begins slipping through their fingers. The dispatcher came back calm, professional, unmistakable. The vehicle involved in the burglary had been stopped nearly 3 miles away. The individual connected to the call had already been detained. No match on plate. No match on driver. No active threat at this location. A woman near pump 4 slowly lowered her phone, then lifted it again, this time with steadier hands. The teenager by the ice freezer took 2 steps closer. Even the clerk behind the glass doors of the convenience store had stopped pretending not to watch. Brandon should have ended it there. A decent officer would have. A decent man would have. But something in him could not stand the idea of backing away in front of witnesses, not after all that noise, not after the broken glass, not after the certainty he had worn like a second badge. So instead of apology, he reached for suspicion. Instead of correction, he reached for tone. He squared his shoulders and looked Elias up and down as if he could still find a reason hidden somewhere in the fabric of a tired man's clothes. "Then why are you sitting out here after midnight?" he demanded. "Why are you acting nervous?" Elias blinked once, almost in disbelief, because it was a question that answered itself. The air smelled like gasoline, cold rain, and something burnt from the hot dog roller inside the store. Somewhere above them, a moth kept battering itself against the buzzing overhead light. Elias spoke carefully, each word measured for survival. He said he had stopped for coffee. He said he had just gotten off work. He said his phone call was still connected if the officer wanted to hear the timestamp. He did not raise his voice. He did not match the aggression in front of him. That, more than anything, seemed to unravel Brandon. You could see it in the stiffness around his mouth, in the way his hand hovered near his belt, in the way he kept glancing toward the growing circle of eyes around them. He was no longer policing a scene. He was trying to outrun humiliation. Then Elias turned his face fully toward him for the first time, and when he spoke again, his voice was low, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. "So now this is not a mistake," he said. "Now it is a choice." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Brandon did not answer right away. He just stared, breathing a little faster, while somewhere in the distance another siren rolled across the city like thunder still deciding where to break. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The words Elias had spoken seemed to hang in the cold air with more weight than the badge on Brandon Cole's chest, and that was the part the officer could not outrun. Not the dispatcher, not the witnesses, not even the broken window. It was the simple truth that from this moment on, every choice belonged to him. The parking lot lights hummed overhead, turning the damp pavement silver, and Elias stood beside his truck with the kind of stillness that did not come from comfort, but from practice. He had learned a long time ago that some nights asked more from a man than patience. Some nights asked for discipline so complete it looked almost unnatural. His breathing stayed even. His hands remained where everyone could see them. A sliver of glass glittered near the collar of his jacket, and he brushed none of it away. Across from him, Brandon shifted his weight, scanning the scene as though he might still find one person willing to hand his certainty back to him. But certainty was gone now. All that remained was evidence. The woman by the gas pump had begun recording again, her phone held upright. Her face set in that particular expression people wear when they realize they may be watching something they will later have to explain. The teenager near the ice freezer was no longer pretending to scroll. Even the automatic doors of the convenience store opened and closed behind two late customers who stepped out, saw the flashing lights, and stopped short under the awning. Brandon cleared his throat and tried to pull authority back into his voice. He asked Elias for identification, registration, proof of insurance. Each phrase clipped and formal now, as though procedure could erase everything that had happened before it. Elias nodded once and said, very carefully, that his wallet was in his left inside pocket and the documents were in the glove compartment. He did not reach until Brandon gave permission, and when he did, every motion was slow enough to make the point without saying it out loud. This was what control looked like. Not shouting, not force, not fear, just a man refusing to let someone else drag him beneath their disorder. Brandon looked over the driver's license when Elias handed it to him, and for the first time his eyes narrowed with something other than accusation. He read the name. He read the address in a quiet suburb nearly 20 minutes away. He saw the employer identification badge clipped at Elias's belt, the kind issued by a major engineering contractor outside St. Louis. None of it matched the story he had rushed to tell himself. None of it fit the image he had chosen before he ever asked a single question. The radio crackled again, softer this time, and another unit acknowledged traffic nearby. Somewhere beyond the edge of the lot, that approaching siren Elias had heard moments earlier was growing louder. Brandon heard it too. You could tell by the way his shoulders tightened. Reinforcement should have felt like rescue, but instead it looked like exposure arriving on schedule. Elias glanced once toward the road, then back at Brandon, his voice calm enough to make the silence around it sharper. You should decide what kind of report you want to give, he said. Because every second after that radio call belongs to the truth. And as the distant patrol car turned into the lot, washing the storefront in a fresh sweep of red and blue, Brandon finally began to understand that this was no longer a scene he could manage. It was a record. The second patrol car rolled into the lot without urgency, but somehow that made it feel heavier, as if the night itself had decided there would be witnesses with badges as well as without them. Its headlights swept across the storefront windows, over the gas pumps, and finally across Elias Turner standing beside his truck, his shirt still neat except for the shimmer of broken safety glass near the door frame and along the edge of the seat. Officer Brandon Cole took one step back, then squared himself as if posture alone could rebuild the ground that had shifted under him. The new arrival stepped out, a broad-shouldered sergeant with a lined face and the kind of silence that usually meant he had seen too much to be impressed by noise. Daniel Reeves did not rush. He glanced at the damaged window, then at Elias, then at Brandon, and the order of that glance said everything. "What happened here?" he asked. Brandon opened his mouth fast, too fast, words arriving before thought could clean them up. He said he had responded to a vehicle matching a description. He said the subject had appeared evasive. He said the situation was fluid. He said he made a judgment call. But there was a weakness in the way he stacked those sentences, as if each one hoped to hide inside the one before it. Reeves listened without interruption, though his eyes drifted once toward the woman holding up her phone and once toward the body camera mounted on Brandon's chest. Elias did not speak immediately. He understood something important in that moment. Men like Brandon often counted on chaos to do half their work for them. They counted on raised voices, confusion, fear, and the public instinct to move on. But order had just arrived, and Elias intended to meet it with calm. When Reeves finally turned to him, Elias answered with simple facts. He said he had stopped for coffee after work. He said Officer Cole approached and ordered him out before asking a single question. He said dispatch later confirmed the actual suspect had already been detained elsewhere. He did not dramatize anything. He did not decorate the truth. He handed it over plain, because plain truth is harder to attack than anger. Reeves looked at the truck again, at the cracked edges still clinging to the frame, at the license and registration Elias had already produced, and the lines around his mouth deepened. The clerk from inside the store came halfway through the automatic doors and called out that the outside camera covered all 4 pumps and most of the front lot. That changed the air in an instant. Brandon heard it too. Everyone did. Suddenly, this was not just memory or testimony or perspective. This was time-stamped footage under fluorescent light. Brandon tried once more to regain some official footing. He said the camera would show he was acting in the interest of public safety. He said he had to make split-second decisions. But the phrase sounded thin now, not because procedure never mattered, but because procedure had already spoken through dispatch and he had ignored it. Elias watched Reeves absorb that fact, and he could almost see the moral geometry of the scene settling into place. The broken window was no longer the center of it. Neither was the stop. The true shape of the night was simpler and far more dangerous for Brandon. He had been given a chance to correct himself, and instead he chose to continue. Reeves stepped closer to Brandon, lowering his voice just enough that the lot had to lean into the silence to feel it. "Did you hear dispatch confirm the suspect was in custody before you continued this stop?" Brandon hesitated. It was only a pause, maybe 1 second, maybe less, but everybody there felt it. Because sometimes a pause tells the truth before a person does. Brandon finally answered, but the answer came out slower than any of his earlier commands, stripped of that sharp confidence that had carried him into the parking lot like he owned the night. He said he heard dispatch. He said he was still assessing the situation. He said officer safety required him to remain engaged until he felt comfortable clearing the scene. Sergeant Daniel Reeves did not react right away, and that quiet was worse for Brandon than anger would have been. The older man simply stood there beneath the convenience store lights, one hand resting near his duty belt, his gaze moving from Brandon to the shattered window and back again, as if measuring not just the facts but the space between them. Around them, the cold Missouri air seemed to sharpen every sound. A truck rumbled past on the road beyond the station. The automatic doors sighed open and shut. Someone near the pumps whispered, too softly to make out the words, but not too softly to remind Brandon that this had become public in the worst possible way. Elias Turner remained exactly where he had been asked to stand, his documents now back in his hand, his breathing level, his face unreadable except for the faint weariness in his eyes. That weariness mattered. It was not the fatigue of a long shift anymore. It was the look of a man who had seen this kind of moment before, maybe not with the same details, maybe not under this exact light, but in the same moral shape. The same instant when he had to decide whether to protect his dignity in silence or let another man write a false story over his life. Reeves asked Brandon whether Elias had made any threatening movement. Brandon said no. He asked whether Elias had refused commands before dispatch corrected the identification. Brandon hesitated again, then said no, not exactly. Reeves asked whether there had been any indication at all, after the radio confirmation, that continuing the detention was justified. This time Brandon did not answer quickly enough to pretend certainty. He looked toward Elias's truck, toward the people recording, toward the store camera mounted under the awning, and what he found in every direction was the same thing: no exit. It is a hard thing for some men to discover that authority does not disappear all at once. It leaks out of them in front of witnesses, one excuse at a time. Elias lifted his chin slightly and looked at Reeves, not with hostility, not with pleading, but with the composure of someone who understood that truth did not need help sounding stronger than a lie already collapsing under its own weight. He said that the store cameras likely captured the entire stop from the moment Brandon approached. He added that his call log would show he had been speaking with his sister until the moment the officer ordered him out. Then, after the smallest pause, he said something even quieter. He said his daughter would be awake in less than 5 hours for school, and he still needed to get home. The sentence changed the feeling of the scene in a way no legal argument could. Suddenly, the broken glass was not only evidence. It was inconvenience, humiliation, disruption, another theft from a man who had done nothing except exist in the wrong place under the wrong gaze. Reeves took that in. You could see it settle behind his eyes. He turned to Brandon and asked for the body camera status. Brandon said it had been running. Reeves nodded once, and that single motion felt almost ceremonial, as if the night had just crossed from accusation into record. Then he told Brandon to step aside. Not loudly, not dramatically, just 4 words spoken in a tone that ended debate. Brandon did not move at first, and for a flicker of a second the old instinct seemed to rise in him again, that desperate belief that posture could still hold together what judgment had already broken. But then he saw the phones, the camera under the awning, the dispatcher's call preserved on audio, and the calm on Elias's face, and he stepped back at last, because even he could feel it now. The story no longer belonged to the man with the badge. It belonged to the truth that had outlived him. Sergeant Daniel Reeves did not look at Elias first after Brandon stepped back. He looked at the truck. He looked at the jagged edge where the glass had given way. He looked at the fine shimmer of safety fragments scattered across the seat, the console, the dark pavement below the door. Then he lifted his eyes toward the store camera mounted under the awning and let that silence do its work. In that silence, the whole scene seemed to rearrange itself. What had entered the night as noise and authority now stood there as sequence and proof. Brandon remained a few feet away, shoulders rigid, face drained of the hard certainty that had first brought him to the driver's side window. He was still trying to stand like a man in control, but the posture no longer matched the moment. Reeves asked the clerk whether the exterior cameras recorded audio or video only. The clerk, a thin man in a gray store polo with a name tag that read Marcus, said the front system captured video across the lot and timestamped every angle facing the pumps and parking spaces. He said the owner could pull the footage from the office in less than 5 minutes. Reeves nodded once and told him not to overwrite anything. The woman at pump 4, still holding her phone chest high, spoke up next. She said she had seen Elias sitting in the truck before the officer ever walked up. She said he had not jumped out, had not rushed anyone, had not done anything but sit there with his hands visible. Her voice shook a little, not because she was uncertain, but because public truth can feel strange when it has to push against official power. Reeves thanked her and asked for her name. Brandon stared at the asphalt. The teenager by the ice freezer, suddenly braver now that the shape of the night was changing, added that he had started recording right after he heard the officer yelling. He said dispatch came over the radio before things calmed down, and he remembered that part because everyone had gone quiet for a second. Elias listened to all of it with his jaw set and his breathing steady. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to pile on. He understood the difference between revenge and record, and tonight the record was doing more damage than anger ever could. Reeves then asked Elias if he needed medical attention. Elias answered no, just a broom, a replacement window, and the rest of his night back if the world was feeling generous. It was the first thing he had said with even the faintest trace of dry humor, and somehow that made the lot feel even stiller. A few people exhaled. Brandon did not. Men who rely on intimidation often do not know what to do when the person they try to shrink refuses to become smaller. Reeves glanced at the employer badge clipped near Elias's belt and asked where he worked. Elias told him he was a senior field systems engineer for a defense contractor outside St. Louis, and that he had been on site since early that morning dealing with a calibration issue that ran long past schedule. He did not say it to impress anyone. He said it because facts belonged in order. The answer landed quietly, but it landed. Another piece of false assumption fell away from the scene. Brandon had not misread suspicious behavior. He had rushed past an ordinary life because he had already decided what kind of man sat behind that wheel. Reeves seemed to understand that too. He turned at last and faced Brandon fully. The overhead light caught the strain around the younger officer's eyes. "I am going to review your body camera and the store footage," Reeves said. "Until then, you are finished making decisions on this scene." There was no anger in the words, which made them final in a deeper way. Brandon opened his mouth as if to defend himself again, then closed it. Somewhere beyond the lot, the wind moved through the power lines with a low, restless hum, and Elias looked at the broken edge of his window before lifting his eyes toward the road home. He was not free of the night yet, but for the first time since Brandon stepped out of the dark with a conclusion already written, the balance had begun to return. The night did not end with a shout. It narrowed instead, becoming quieter, sharper, more exact. Sergeant Daniel Reeves stepped a few feet away with Marcus from the store, speaking in low professional tones about the camera system and the timestamp on the exterior feed, while the bystanders remained where they were, no longer drifting off the way people usually do when trouble starts to settle. That was because this no longer felt like ordinary trouble. It felt like the moment after a curtain had been pulled back, when everyone could suddenly see the machinery that had been making the noise. Elias Turner stood beside his truck and rolled one shoulder slowly, more from stiffness than pain, then looked through the broken opening where the window had been. The inside of the cab looked violated in a quiet way that made it worse. Not destroyed, not dramatic, just disturbed. Tiny beads of glass caught the red and blue reflection from the cruisers and threw it back in 100 cold sparks across the seat, where he had been sitting less than 10 minutes earlier thinking about getting home. His phone still rested in the center console, the call long disconnected, the screen dark now, but he could still hear his sister's last words in his mind as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "Get home safe." It was a small sentence. Most loving things are. And yet here he was, held in place by the kind of mistake that had stopped being a mistake the second Brandon Cole chose pride over correction. Reeves came back and asked Elias whether there was anyone he needed to call. Elias said no at first, then paused and admitted he should probably call home before his daughter woke up early and found his truck still gone. He said it plainly, but something about hearing him place his family back inside the scene gave the moment more weight than the broken glass ever had. Reeves nodded and told him to make the call. Brandon remained near the second patrol car, not handcuffed, not humiliated in any theatrical sense, but isolated in a way that made his silence louder than anything he had said all night. He kept glancing toward Reeves, then toward the store, then toward the dark road beyond the gas station, as if he were searching for some version of events that still left room for dignity. But dignity cannot survive long inside denial. The woman who had been recording lowered her phone for the first time and walked a few steps closer to Elias. She did not say much. She just asked if he was all right and whether he wanted her contact information in case a statement was needed later. Elias thanked her and said yes. The teenager followed, suddenly serious in a way only truth can make a young face serious, and offered to send his video too. Elias thanked him as well. It was not a dramatic alliance, just ordinary people deciding not to look away, and in some ways that was the strongest thing that had happened all night. Reeves returned once more, holding a small notepad now, and asked Elias to walk him through the stop from the beginning, step by step, in his own words. Elias did. He He started with pulling into the lot after work. He mentioned the coffee he had intended to buy, the call with his sister, the lights approaching from behind, the commands that came before questions, the radio correction, and the choice Brandon made after hearing it. He never once raised his voice. He never reached for grand language or easy fury. He simply laid the facts down one after another like stones across moving water. By the time he finished, Reeves had stopped writing and was just listening. The older sergeant looked at Elias for a moment, then at Brandon, and what passed across his face was not surprise. It was recognition. Recognition of a pattern. Recognition of the cost. Recognition that some reports are about more than incidents because some incidents reveal the soul of the person writing them. Reeves closed the notepad and said the footage from the store and the body camera would be preserved immediately. Then he told Elias, with the careful tone of a man choosing words that needed to last, what happens next will not be decided by volume. It will be decided by record. And for the first time that night, Elias let out a breath deep enough to sound like relief, because he knew those words were not a promise of comfort. They were something better. They were a promise that the truth would no longer need permission. Marcus returned from the office less than 4 minutes later carrying a small black flash drive in one hand and a printed incident timestamp in the other, and somehow those two ordinary objects changed the atmosphere more than the patrol lights ever had. Evidence has a way of cooling a scene. It removes the last shelter for performance. Sergeant Daniel Reeves took the drive, checked the timestamp against the dispatch log on his phone, then looked up at the front camera mounted beneath the awning as if he could already see the whole sequence playing back in his mind. Elias Turner stood beside the open frame of his truck door, one hand resting lightly near the roofline, and watched the exchange with the patience of a man who knew that truth often moved slower than harm, but usually arrived with better memory. Brandon Cole did not say anything. He had gone quiet in the way some people do when they realize words are no longer building protection around them, but stripping it away. Reeves asked Marcus whether the system automatically uploaded backup footage to the cloud. Marcus said yes, every 12 hours, and added that the owner also kept incident copies whenever police activity occurred on the property. That detail landed hard, though nobody reacted outwardly. It meant the night could not simply be talked around later. It had already begun to outlive the people standing in it. Reeves then asked Brandon to hand over the body camera for review. The younger officer hesitated for only a second before unclipping it, but that second told its own story. He passed it over with the tight, controlled movement of a man trying not to show the shake in his pride. Reeves accepted it without comment and gave it to the other responding officer to secure. The bystanders had grown quieter now, not because the tension was gone, but because the shape of justice had become visible and nobody wanted to interrupt it. The woman from Pump 4 folded her arms against the cold. The teenager near the freezer leaned against the ice machine, phone lowered at last, as if he understood this part did not need him to film it to make it real. Elias reached into the truck carefully and took out his phone. He stepped 2 paces away and called home. His voice softened in a way that changed the entire scene. He told his sister he had been delayed. He told her he was all right. He asked if his daughter was still asleep. Then he listened, eyes lowered, one hand pressed against the bridge of his nose. For just a second, and thanked her for staying up. When he ended the call, the silence around him felt respectful rather than watchful. Reeves turned back toward Brandon and asked one final question, plain and direct. After dispatch confirmed the actual suspect had already been detained, why did you continue the stop? Brandon swallowed, looked toward the road, then toward the broken window, then finally at no one in particular. He said he thought Elias was being evasive. He said something did not feel right. He said he trusted his instincts. The words might have sounded reasonable in another context, but not here, not under a camera, not after correction, not beside a truck that belonged to a man with a work badge, a clean record, a call log, witnesses, and nowhere near the description of the actual suspect. Reeves let the answer settle, then said quietly, "Instinct is not a license to ignore facts." Nobody responded, because nobody needed to. The sentence stood on its own. Elias looked at Brandon then, not with triumph, not even with anger, but with the weary clarity of a man who had seen exactly what unchecked certainty could do when it wore a uniform. And in that moment, under the hard white gas station lights, Brandon seemed to understand something far worse than embarrassment. He understood that this night would follow him not because of one bad assumption, but because after the truth arrived, he chose himself over it. Reeves did not raise his voice when he ended it. He simply turned to the other responding officer and instructed him to log the body camera, secure the dispatch record, and note every witness willing to provide a statement before the night was over. Then he faced Brandon Cole one last time and told him he was relieved from further field action pending immediate review. The words were procedural, almost plain, but they landed with the weight of a door closing. Brandon stood there beneath the convenience store lights with his hands at his sides, not arguing now, not demanding, not shaping the air with confidence the way he had when he first walked up to Elias Turner's truck. Whatever authority had carried him into that parking lot had thinned into something smaller and more fragile, something that could not survive evidence, witnesses, and a supervisor who still knew the difference between instinct and abuse. Elias watched the exchange in silence. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. The night had taken enough from him already. His truck window was still gone, the cold air still cutting through the opening where glass should have been, and the long drive home would still be loud and uncomfortable. But the deepest injury had never been the window. It had been the assumption behind it, the speed with which a man in uniform had looked at him and decided that force belonged before questions. That was the thing sitting in the air even now, long after the shouting was gone. Marcus from the store came back out carrying a broom and a small cardboard tray. Without making a speech of it, he offered both to Elias and said the owner would print a copy of the surveillance stills if needed. The woman from Pump 4 wrote her number on the back of a receipt and handed it over. The teenager near the ice freezer promised to send the video before he went to sleep. One by one, ordinary people did the quiet work that keeps truth from being buried. And maybe that was the part Brandon had never counted on. He understood fear. He understood confusion. He understood how fast a false story could spread when the wrong person was made to feel alone. What he had not counted on was record. What he had not counted on was a man who stayed calm enough to let the facts stand untouched. Reeves asked Elias whether he needed assistance covering the opening before driving home, and Marcus returned with a clear plastic sheet and tape from the stockroom. Together, under the humming lights and the fading pulse of red and blue, they secured the frame well enough to keep out the worst of the wind. The gesture was simple, but it carried something larger inside it. Repair would not happen all at once. It rarely does. First comes the damage. Then comes the witness. Then comes the record. Then, if the world is honest for long enough, comes consequence. Elias thanked them, slid carefully into the driver's seat, and set his phone on the console beside the papers Brandon had once demanded as though suspicion were a right. Before he closed the door, he looked up through the open frame at Brandon, who stood near the second patrol car staring at nothing he could fix. Elias said only one thing. You had the truth, and you still chose me. He did not say it with hatred. That would have made it easier for Brandon to dismiss. He said it with the tired clarity of a man naming exactly what had happened. Then he pulled the door shut as best he could against the plastic cover, started the engine, and eased out of the lot. Behind him, the lights still flashed, but they no longer belonged to fear. They belonged to a record already moving forward without permission. Because in the end, he did not need power to defeat power. He only needed the truth to survive long enough to be seen. And that night, under hard white lights and the eyes of strangers, truth did what shattered glass could not. It reflected the man who broke it.